You can see we painted a leaf in the last video. This time we're going to paint a leaf again. We're also going to do something with this piece of paper that I'll talk about in a moment. So I'm going to paint this leaf. You can see I've got my paint. Hopefully you're noticing, oh no, the brush is bristled down in the water. That's not good for it. So I'm actually going to take this brush out. Notice how I'm dragging it along the edge. That means that it's not going to be soaking wet when I take it out and set it on my table. I'm going to use, this water is a little bit muddy, but it's not too dirty, so I'm going to use this water. And this time I'm going to use this brush just to show you how, even with a larger brush, you can still get kind of precise. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So I've got this brush wet, and I'm going to set my cup of water aside. I'm going to mix two colors for this one. So what I want to point out here, I'm going to use this pencil to help me do that, is there are blobs of color here. That's the actual watercolor. This is watercolor that's currently wet. Over here you can see, here's a blob of color, blob of color, blob of color. So that's where the live watercolor is. If I want to mix like a more vibrant color, I want to touch that blob of color. So I want to use this red, and I'm going to use just a little bit of that orange. And got something on my brush here, so I'm just going to try to take that little bit off. And yeah, so this brush is wet. I'm going to touch this red so that I make it live, ready to go. It's not too wet. And now I just want a little bit of this orange. So I'm touching just the corner of my brush onto that orange. And I'm going to mix those two colors together. And so I've got kind of an orange red now. And you can tell it's not a lot of paint. Just want to see what happens if I use just kind of a damp brush with some paint on it. And remember, this brush is not ideal, but I'm going to show you how I can control it just by using the corner here. So just that outer corner. I'm just going to touch. So this brush might actually be useful. So I'm just going to touch those corners of the leaf. So every place where there's one of those kind of jagged edges, I'm just touching. This is a great exercise to see how well you can control your medium. So if I get down here to the corner, I just want to, so I'm kind of filling in some of that area. I'm just using the corner of the brush to do some painting. So it's maybe not ideal. Maybe I would want a different brush if I was going to be serious about making a painting. But I just want to show you that you can do this work even with a brush that's maybe not larger. So I'm going to come back, and I'm just painting these corners, practicing that control. That's a part of this work that we're doing, is practicing that control of your brush. With watercolors, it's really important, especially if you're going to try to get into some fine details, to practice that control. This technique, if you remember, I said at the beginning, this is wet on dry. So the paper is dry, and I'm bringing that wet brush to it. And you can see how watercolors kind of does what watercolors does. So some of this, because the paper was already dry and this brush wasn't very wet, where the watercolors was wet before, it dried. And now when I bring the brush onto it, you can see some of those brush strokes. So I'm building up some layers. And you can just see how very quickly, because it's wet, or because the paper is dry, the watercolors dry very quickly, and it just builds up layers in a kind of unique and visually interesting way. So I'm going to set that one aside. I'm going to pick up my plain piece of paper. One of my expectations is that you're going to, I want you to paint 4 distinct layers. So I'm going to go back to my smaller brush, my number 8 round, and I'm going to use, you can use whatever color you would like. Because I've got a different color, I'm going to use this blue color. Sometimes if you have water that has, kind of muddy, this is kind of a yellowish, maybe almost even a light brown. If I mix that with blue, it could make yellow, but there's so much water here that that's not going to be an issue for me. So I'm bringing a fair amount of water on the brush over to this blue paint, and what I want to do, this is kind of tricky, I want to paint right up to the edge. I'm doing wet on dry again, and I'm practicing my control. I don't want to touch the edge of the paper. I just want to paint really close to the edge, but not touch the edge. And I just want to cover this whole piece of paper with a single layer of this blue color. So I'm practicing control, and I'm creating layer number one. We are going to eventually paint four distinct layers of paint on this piece of paper. So just practicing my control, covering the entire piece of paper with a single layer. Spoke before in the video about how when water touches the surface of this paper and it's only on one side, it causes the paper to curl. You can see that it's naturally doing that. So what's happening is the fibers inside the paper are shrinking, and the fibers on the back side of the paper, because they're not wet, are not shrinking. And that's why it's causing it to, sometimes it's called buckling. So we've painted a leaf now with a wet on wet technique. We painted a leaf with a wet on dry technique. And we've painted a first layer on this piece of paper. Thanks for watching.